Hello, everybody. Hello, and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 618th New Social Environment. I'm Raven, the Programs Associate here, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Dorota Glowacka, Amanda Sciampacone, Shelley Angelie Saggar, Jade Montserrat, and with Keren Hammerschlag and Suzy Russell. A special thanks to Tanya Sheehan and Suzanne Perling-Hudson for organizing today's event. And we're thrilled to welcome today's poet, Timothy Liu, here to close today's program. Before we get started, the Brooklyn Rail acknowledges Black Lives Matter. The Brooklyn Rail acknowledges Black Lives Matter and that here in New York, we are on Lenape-Hoking, the unceded lands and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation. We recognize land acknowledgements are not a replacement for actual necessary decolonial work, but a reminder of place of the legacies of dispossession and enslavement that sustain and enrich the stolen land that we are speaking from. And now to introduce today's guests and hosts. University of King's College, Dr. Dorota Glowacka holds a PhD in English and Comparative Literature from the State University of New York at Buffalo and an MA in English at the University of Wrocław. Art historian Amanda Sciampacone explores the intersections between British art, visual culture, medicine, and the environment in the long 19th century. She is currently a staff tutor in art history at the Open University. Chase-funded PhD researcher and museum worker Shelley Angelie Saggar is based across the School of English and the Center for Indigenous and Settler Colonial Studies at the University of Kent. Jade Montserrat is an artist based in Whitby, England. She was the recipient of the Stuart Hall Foundation Scholarship supporting her PhD at IBAR, UC-Land, and the development of her work from her Black diasporic perspective in the north of England. Jade works through performance, drawing, painting, film, installation, sculpture, print, and text. Introduce our host today. The research of Keren Hammerschlag focuses on the 19th century British art and visual culture and the many intersections and frictions between art and medicine during the Victorian and Edwardian periods. She is currently the senior lecturer in art history and curatorship in the Center for Art History and Curatorship at the Australian National University in Canberra. Suzy Russell holds a Bachelor of Philosophy from the Australian National University, where she explored a collective pain under the Pinochet dictatorship in Chile for her honors in anthropology. She now works at the National Library. And now to pass it over to Suzanne.
Thank you so much. My remarks are going to be exceedingly brief today. My colleague Tanya will give a kind of slightly longer, but still quite short introduction to our series and to today. But I just really want to take the opportunity to thank Chloe and Raven and Eleanor and Fong and everyone at the Rail for bringing us together today, and to all of our speakers. We're so grateful for your presence and willingness to engage and share your work.
Thanks so much, Suzanne. I want to echo those thanks as well, and share with everyone the goals of this series, which are to explore the relations between art and healing, to share diverse perspectives across the global visual arts community, to showcase new voices and emerging projects, and to communicate across multiple interested audiences and disciplines. We have a few questions that are central to our work. One is, how do we define the notions of art and healing? Another is, how does art represent ideas about health, healing, and care or care work? And then finally, in what spaces can this work happen and for whom? The series began by considering art and healing in the present moment. We reflected on the COVID pandemic and its intersection with questions about art and social justice. And we've since turned to historical contexts, but we'll continue to reflect on the relationship between the past and present. Today's conversation focuses on the subject of colonial trauma and healing and features art historians, critics, and makers. I want to turn things over to Keren Hammerschlag, who's going to introduce the specific subject of today's conversation.
Well, thank you so much, Tanya and Suzanne. I just want to express my pleasure at being part of this absolutely wonderful series. It's been enlightening. So I'd like to start by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you from the unceded lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people in what is now called Canberra, and to pay my respects to elders, First Nation elders, past, present, and emerging. I'd also like to extend a special welcome to any First Nations people who are joining us today. So thank you to the curators of the series looking after Tanya and Suzanne, and to the team at the Brooklyn Rail, especially Raven, for all of their support. I'm extremely excited to be co-convening this event on colonial trauma and the art of healing. Thank you to Dorota, Amanda, Shelley, and Jade for your willingness to participate in this important conversation. So the conversationalists today represent a wide range of scholarly, curatorial, educational, and artistic approaches to the history and representation of the ongoing traumas of colonialization, colonialism, and race-based genocide. So I'm Keren Hammerschlag, and my interests in the subject stem from my work on race in 19th century anatomical atlases, as well as an ongoing project about depictions of racial difference and racial indeterminacy in Victorian painting, with a focus on the fraught relationship between white male artists and their often non-white female models and subjects. So I'm very keen to learn more from our participants about historical and contemporary art practices that grapple with colonial trauma and the potential of art to address, even heal, some of the violences performed in the name of colonial expansion and consolidation, starting with a few words from my co-convener, Suzy Russell. I'm going to hand over to you, Suzy.
Thanks, Keren, and I'm also just really delighted to be here joining you. And I'll also acknowledge that I am joining from unceded and stolen Ngunnawal, Ngunnawal, Ngambri country in Canberra, Australia's capital, and I offer my respect to elders. So I'm a PhD candidate at the Centre for Art History and Art Theory at the Australian National University, and my doctoral project is about sympathetic pregnancy and non-gestational relationships to pregnancy. And there's actually quite a significant connection to 19th century colonial race making, and that's through the concept of couvade. So this is an idea basically from 19th century anthropologists of childbed or male lying in, that really was ascribed to so-called primitive and uncivilized peoples. So there's a highly racialized element in history to the work that I'm doing. I just wanted to begin by offering a couple of reflections really grounded in the work of Indigenous scholars, artists, activists here in Australia. So just in recent times, in the past few weeks, the great Uncle Archie Roach, a Gunditjmara Bundjalung storyteller and songman, has died, and this has had a huge impact in this part of the world. So I just wanted to acknowledge that, and also to mention to anyone who doesn't know his incredible music, which is really being described as very sort of cathartic and healing, that it's something you may want to listen to. And in particular, his song Took the Children Away is referring to Australia's stolen generations. And also very recently, you may in Australia, Senator Lydia Thorpe, who's a Djab Wurrung, Gunai and Gunditjmara woman, used her opportunity of being sworn in, her swearing in oath, to refer to the Queen as a coloniser, and this has generated some media coverage here and overseas. Hopefully you may have seen a photo that accompanied this moment, which is a really powerful, staunch image of Lydia giving the Black Power salute sort of on the floor of Parliament. And I now just want to move along to just a couple of artworks, again, as an offering into our conversation. So the one that you have on screen now is from Trawulway artist Julie Goff's Medical series, which is from 1994. And you can see the Australian continent there in a kidney dish on some scales. And you can also see alongside within the box, highly racist text of colonial times, referring to eyes of different peoples, different ethnicities. If we can move on to our next slide. Thank you. Both Goth and Kolkata and Nungurru artist Yoni Scarce really powerfully surface the effects of colonisation. And again, as with the other Indigenous people that I've mentioned, offer us truth-telling. So here we can see detail from Scarce's installation, Weak in Colour but Strong in Blood, which is from 2015-16, so some 10 years on from Julie Goff's work. In which blown glass vessels recalling bush fruits are variously held on medical trolleys and distorted by medical instruments in a really strong reference to eugenic practices, in particular anthropologists. So that's where I'd like to conclude my initial opening thoughts, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
Hello, I'm Amanda Sciampacone. I'm a staff tutor at the Open University, and I'm very grateful to be part of this conversation. Thank you for the invitation to include me here. So I work on the visual culture of the 19th century cholera epidemics that struck Britain in the 19th century. And I'm just going to kind of give you an overview of the kinds of images I look at and some loose interpretations around them. So here, we have a broadsheet from when cholera first spreads into England, identifying it very clearly as not an English disease. So here you have something that's very clearly graphically laid out as an Indian disease. And the reason for this is that while cholera exists prior to the 19th century in Europe, it's framed as cholera nostra, or English cholera, and it's a seemingly mild illness. But in 1817, medics report that they notice a virulent form of cholera spreading in the Ganges Delta. And from there, it's European medics claim that it's spread through Asia, Europe, and into the UK. So here you have this new disease, and what is seen as a mystery disease in the 19th century. Nobody knows how it spreads. It's not until the end of the 19th century that the microbe for cholera is identified. So here you have this mystery disease that is framed as an other. It's according to British medics, it's an Indian disease. Next slide, please. And so you have this reiteration of its Indian identity through medical and satirical imagery produced around that first epidemic. So this is a map from the Lancet that shows cholera's movement across Asia and Europe by identifying cities where it's hit. And right at the bottom right, kind of shoehorned in, is the Indian subcontinent, and then in an inset next to that is the seeming origin point of this seemingly new disease, which is Jasor in the Ganges Delta. So you have this kind of medical iteration that this is an illness that is not British, right? It comes from outside of Britain and enters Britain from elsewhere. Next slide, please. And images of India produced by European artists really emphasize the difference of the subcontinent's climate in comparison to European climate, because this is identified as the environment in which malignant illnesses like epidemic cholera emerge. Of course, this is not the case scientifically, but there's a real kind of concerted effort to make the claim that tropical environments, non-British environments, are the source of epidemics. And so you have this this image produced by a Scottish artist of a boulevard in Calcutta, emphasizing the kind of the oppressiveness of the heat of the sun. So the majority of the people are in the shade, and emphasizing the rhetoric of colonial civilization as kind of doing away with the natural environment and reforming it as something that is in line with European notions of civilization, right? We clear away the old to build the new, which is incredibly problematic. Next slide, please. And here you just have an image of what's seen as the effects of cholera, the symptoms, the classical symptoms of cholera, produced by the Lancet. This is the first image of an English cholera sufferer, according to the Lancet. So here, what you have really is the first image that would be seen by British medics in Britain of its effects, and it's striking, right? So here, this disease is portrayed as something that transforms the body of the sufferer from a kind of healthy English person into what looks like a cadaver with blue tinted skin. So this generates a lot of fear around cholera, the fact that it has this kind of power to remake the British body into something else. Next slide, please. Cholera is also portrayed as a personified entity. So here you have it represented as a personification of a kind of skeletal figure of death, indiscriminately trampling armies. And we might recall from the COVID epidemic, similar rhetoric around invisible killers, invisible muggers in the press. Cholera was framed as the invisible destroyer. Next slide, please. It's also represented as something that's fake, that doctors made up for profit. So here to try and sell remedies or to send people to cholera hospitals. But also an iconography of cholera emerges in these images. So the blueness is really focused upon, the fact that it changes the skin blue. And so cholera here is represented as this kind of skeletal blue scarecrow, and also the kind of cadaverous appearance of the sufferers played up in that skeletal figure. Next slide. Again, the reiteration of its Oriental origins. So another puppet with a blue face, but here wearing Oriental costume, right? So really emphasizing that this is an Indian disease in the visual culture. Next slide. And finally, this image that again personifies cholera as a real agent, right? No longer is it a puppet. It is an entity that is trying to cross the boundaries into England to threaten English progress, specifically here trying to steal the Reform Bill. So in these early portrayals and during the first epidemic of cholera that strikes Britain, you have the visual culture really emphasizing that this is not a British disease, this is an Indian entity. And coming through the COVID pandemic, that's still the case. So next slide, please. Initial reporting around COVID used photographs of visibly East Asian people wearing masks as the kind of signifier of the pandemic, right? Especially travelers coming into the UK. So the implication here is that the body that carries COVID is not, again, a British body. It is an East Asian body, which is really problematic. And headlines around the China virus, killer virus, that get reiterated by certain politicians. And finally, my last slide. And so there is this parallel, right? There's this absolute parallel between past representations of pandemics and the way that our current pandemic has been represented. This notion that certain bodies carry particular illnesses and bring them across borders into other countries, and the problematic nature around that of racializing illness, leading to well, in the case of COVID, a rise in anti-Asian hate crimes. So overall, to think about the concept of the theme of today's talk, which is colonial trauma and the art of healing, I think what I've really reflected on is the trauma aspect of that, and how that trauma continues to be enacted by essentially colonizers, both in the past in the 19th century and certainly in the present. And the importance of identifying those issues, of identifying the way that we still frame illness as in terms of the other, in terms of race, and how recognizing that is important in the process of healing. We have to identify the problem before we can even think to start addressing and healing that problem. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, both of you already. These are brilliant conversations, and I'm really glad to be here and be part of them today. So my name's Shelley. I am a PhD researcher based at the University of Kent, and I also moonlight as a museum worker occasionally as well. Yeah, I'm really pleased to be able to kind of share just a little bit about my practice and process with you all. So thanks in advance for your attention. So if we can just have this next page, please. Thank you. So the museum that I do most of my work with really is Wellcome Collection, which is by and large a museum in London, UK. It's considered these days as a fairly small museum. It's independent. It's not our kind of more famous national collections, but it's worth noting that its historic collections were once vast and continue to really kind of comprise an expansive set of objects, some of which are now managed by the Science Museum, which is where I'm currently based. So if we could just have the next page as well, please. Thank you. So just by way of kind of, I suppose, introducing the collections that I work with, they were amassed by Sir Henry Wellcome, who really kind of sought to, I suppose, tell the story of humanity's approach to healthcare and medicine, really through his collection of artifacts. These included significant amounts of ethnographic material, which, you know, for his time was considered progressive. But as you might imagine, in the late 19th and early 20th century, this was also organized very much along a kind of, you know, a sort of teleological narrative, very much starting from a notion of so-called primitiveness to kind of more technological, obviously European notions of progress. And I think you can still really get a sense of this if you just take a look at these two pictures, which are taken from two fairly recent permanent galleries, Medicine Man and Medicine Now. As you can just about glean from these, you know, kind of fairly sparse images, Medicine Now, which is on your left, is fairly gloomy, it's dark, it contains, as I think you can just about see at the front, a large amount of ethnographic material. It's really kind of a framing for, you know, quote unquote curios. In contrast, Medicine Now on the right, which has since been updated, but it's worth kind of focusing on, really sort of strives to, you know, kind of be illuminated both in terms of how it's literally lit in contrast to the other gallery, but also in terms of what it focuses on, which is very much this notion of the kind of progress of scientific research. And so as a result of these kinds of curatorial framings, the inheritance that the Contemporary Museum is currently working with is missing information. You know, some of the descriptions we hold contain offensive terminology, and as a result, it's quite difficult, therefore, to reconnect with source communities, for example. In 2019, Wellcome Collection and Museum, who now jointly manage the remaining material, undertook a project to essentially audit and develop, you know, a process for appropriately dealing with sacred, secret, and otherwise potentially sensitive items in collections. So amongst these fairly common institutional difficulties, you know, lack of information, etc., my research and curatorial practice has really sought to recover and restore narratives of agency, recorded or otherwise, amongst some of those who are represented in particularly the colonial era collections. So this slide, as you can see, the image here and the accompanying caption, is an object that I encountered on my very first visit to Wellcome, which was in like 2015 or something, before I started working there. I was really intrigued by the object. As you can see, it's incredibly aesthetically detailed and very beautiful. And I really sought to incorporate it then subsequently into my research as an example of how we might kind of think about reframing colonial narratives. in and bring in kind of critical theory from other disciplines into our practice. As you can see from the original label here, it's very much a kind of passive, written in a passive case. There are notable exclusions. The man represented, for example, is not named anywhere. And there's a real kind of colonial gaze that informed the way in which this historic label was written. I should note it's not that historic, it's like from 2007 or something. But really the kind of lack of information made critically interpreting this item quite difficult, as we didn't know who the man represented was or how he came to be in the collection. So if we can have the next page, please. I was really keen to show through my research that the mask might offer an example of how we might restory colonial narratives within our collection. I wanted to draw together in particular literary methods with curatorial practice. My background is in post-colonial literary studies, and my PhD now looks at how contemporary Native American and Maori writers represent the museum through literature and film. So I really kind of drew on a body of critical work that sought to kind of imagine scenarios otherwise, drawing from kind of historical records to think about possibly, more liberatory routes and more liberatory kind of narratives for those who are represented in the collections. My usage, that term has been drawn upon by a lot of theorists, but my usage is primarily drawn from Daniel Heath Justice, Joseph Flower-Kemper, and Lola Olufemi, alongside the work that Saidiya Hartman does with archival practice and literary methods. So just to kind of start wrapping up, if we can have the next page, please. Yeah. To a kind of, reinterpretation initiative in the Medicine Man Gallery. I've contributed a new label which drew upon existing work that had been done by Te Papa Tongarewa, which is the National Museum of Aotearoa in New Zealand. From this research that I contacted them to find out about, we now know that Te Tapua, who is the man represented here, was the eldest son of Te Whanua and was himself a descendant of Pukaki of Ngāti Whakaue, Rotorua. In December 1849, he met Governor Sir George Grey and was persuaded to have his tattooed face cast in plaster. Apparently, and crucially for the work we're trying to do, he expressed no issue with the cast being taken. The welcome mask that you see here is actually a copy of this original mask, which was sent to the British Museum, like so many other things, and several other copies of that mask exist at Te Papa, at Bristol Museum, Pitt Rivers, and likely elsewhere as well. So really just to kind of, link together the research we've been doing with the sort of theme of this discussion, I want to stress really that through recovering this information that already existed and already had been done by Maori scholars in particular, we can maybe go away towards redressing the limits of our own kind of colonial knowledge framings within the museum. We had no idea that this research was already out there. And through this, we might begin to kind of work towards recovering and kind of applying methods such as Hartman's critical fabulation to actual museum objects in the collection. So in emphasizing Te Tapua's agency and consent, we might read him as a kind of 19th century cosmopolitan traveler rather than the sort of passive displayed person that the original label really tries to position him as. And just very briefly to say that alongside my interpretation you see here, we've also retained the original label just to kind of show the difference, and Wellcome Collections also in the process of commissioning a third label, which would be written in Te Reo Māori by a descendant, this is the Maori language, by a descendant of Te Tapua as well, to kind of complete the picture. So I hope that gives like a very quick overview into the research, and yeah, I look forward to our conversations later. Thank you.
Likewise, thank you, the Brooklyn Rail, for inviting me. And I'm Dorota. I'm joining from Chibuktuk, Halifax, which is in Nova Scotia, Canada, located in Mi'kma'ki. That's an ancestral unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq. And the territory is covered by peace and friendship treaties, which were first signed between the British Crown and the Mi'kmaq, Wolastoqiyik, and Passamaquoddy. So I just want to say that we are currently unofficially changing the name of Halifax to Chibuktuk, which is the original Mi'kmaq name and means great water. So that draws attention to the colonial politics of naming and the kind of deep wound that this imposition of colonial names has inflicted on the land and its people. So it's important to call it out in the process of healing from colonial trauma. And since I'm speaking from Canada, let me just remind you that just a few days ago, Pope Francis concluded his visit here, and he asked forgiveness from the survivors of so-called Indian residential schools for the central role of the Catholic Church in genocidal forced assimilation through schools. And in a historic moment, the Pope used the word genocide to describe that violence. And that is how the survivors and their allies have been describing these harms of settler colonialism for decades. So all of this pertains to my current work. Unlike, I think, most of my colleagues here, I'm not a historian of art, I'm not an artist, and I'm primarily a Holocaust scholar, now Holocaust and genocide, and my background is in philosophy. I'm also an immigrant to Canada, and as such, I am a settler. And the fact that my Jewish relatives were murdered in the Holocaust, to me, that doesn't change that fact. As a matter of fact, I think it calls me to responsibility to address settler colonialism even more. My two current projects at the moment focus on gender and genocide and on the intersections of the Holocaust and settler colonial genocide in North America and the relations between the two, actually. So in 2012, as a result of conversations I had with 3 Indigenous colleagues, I started looking at these comparisons between settler colonialism and the Holocaust by Indigenous writers, poets, and artists. So these are the intersections I am attempting to illustrate with this slide. So what you see in the cartoon is a representation of an infamous residential school in Nova Scotia as a Nazi camp. And I thought of these comparisons with the Holocaust as a result of the colonial suppression of Indigenous knowledge systems that caused Indigenous calls for the recognition of the genocide on their own terms to remain unheard. So the philosophical term I draw on is epistemic violence. And these conditions have really changed in Canada in recent years, especially following the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that concluded in 2015 in the direction of Indigenous political and cultural reclamation, resurgence, self-determination. So in that sense, creating decolonial art is a deeply political project and an expression of political sovereignty as much as of cultural agency. So in Canada at the moment, Indigenous writers and artists are the authors of perhaps the most prolific, innovative, multiply awarded artistic and literary works. And institutions, including universities and museums, have been called upon to engage in a process of decolonization. So could I have the next slide, please? Great, thank you. This is the work called entitled Dawn by Anishinaabe artist Rebecca Belmore. And it was just unveiled this July in the atrium of the National Arts Center in Ottawa. And the center sits between National War Memorial and the Parliament building. So in that sense, this artwork is site-specific. It's sitting on the Anishinaabe Algonquin territory. It includes, wood, timber that was clear-cut throughout the colonizing process as like one of the elements of expropriation of natural resources and the destruction of land. So recently, my work has shifted to looking at the Holocaust and the discipline of Holocaust studies and representations of the Holocaust in museums and museum spaces through a decolonial lens. So if I could have the next slide, please. Thank you. I just published a paper where I show that Western knowledge about the annihilation of European Jews has been influenced by systems of knowledge that are grounded in colonial ways of thinking, and that historical knowledge has always been shaped by these colonial, shaped and expressed through these colonial frameworks. So just very quickly, I was comparing visual representations of the stereotype of the Native American vanishing race and the vanished world of Eastern European Jews in light of a cultural genocide and destruction of cultures. If I could quickly have the next slide, please. These are sites of cemeteries. So the points I want to make 3 points. The first one is that words and concepts matter, and that the genesis of even the concept of genocide is tainted with colonial ways of thinking. So the provenance and similarly, I want to think about the provenance of the very idea of art and aesthetics, which is Eurocentric, and which is why up until recently, indigenous cultural productions, cultural objects were referred to as artifacts, and they were housed in ethnographic museums and museums of natural history. So that's problematic, to say the least. And secondly, I want to stress the importance of creating coalitions and spaces of solidarity across different groups. My focus has been on Holocaust survivors and the descendants and victims of settler colonial genocides, but I'm thinking more broadly across the histories of genocides and mass violence, across disciplines, across social groups. And this is also where art plays a crucial role as a space of such encounters. And just very quickly, if I could have the next, oh, sorry, can I have the previous slide, Raven? Thank you. Yes, so I'm part of this research project, Thinking Through the Museum, which is an international partnership of scholars, students, museum professionals from over 20 institutions. And we want to think critically about museums and try to imagine possibilities of intervening, transforming these institutions that are themselves so deeply implicated in colonialism and violence against various groups. And I'm currently coordinating a workshop which will take place in May next year, and will be a series of conversations between here, the National Museum of the American Indian, and the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington. And we will talk about objects in these collections, the provenance, the role in representing the histories of mass violence and genocide, and the role in cultural recovery and in healing from trauma. And my last point, if I could have the next slide, please. Very quickly, I want to draw attention to the role of dominant heteropatriarchal systems of gender in perpetrating genocidal violence, and specifically in how these gendered systems have secured the colonial rule. And this is also why gender and the intersections of gender with race and one's social location is so important in decolonial practices and in the work of healing and repair. Like the very concept of gender is a colonial Eurocentric invention. So under-theorizing and naturalizing gender always is in the interest of colonial power relations. So it is important to unsettle these categories for the work of healing to occur. And this image is a huge shortcut, but what I want to look at how the Holocaust, I'm now looking at how the Holocaust is represented through what I see as gendered objects. And the second 2 images I read as a kind of decolonial intervention into gendered representations. And what you see is a collection of vamps or tops of women's moccasins. And this was a kind of traveling exhibit, but it wasn't really an exhibit. It was a sacred space called Walking with Our Sisters, and that commemorated missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And that exhibit, together with many works of art, often performance art, also like by Rebecca Belmore, Métis artist Hamie Black, Anishinaabe artist Quill Christie Peters, and many, many others played a huge part in the national inquiry into mass violence against Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit peoples that concluded in 2019. So again, I draw attention to the political dimension of these embodied site-specific feminist interventions into these colonial visual regimes. And I think I stop here and we will segue into the next presentation. Thank you.
Thank you,
thank you all for your talks so far, and yeah, I'm really grateful to be brought together through the Brooklyn Rail. I am calling in from, I suppose, the seat of imperial and colonial violence. Whilst I'm not in London, I'm in Scarborough, where at the moment nationally we're please feel free, Raven, to go through the slides. There's quite a few. Just a note on that. I'm going to have the work playing as background, so the works can be interpreted by yourselves, and then maybe there'll be time to focus in the discussion if anything sort of rouses anyone's interest. Yes. Where we've got a leadership election for our next unelected Prime Minister at the hustings recently, Rishi Sunak, I think would potentially send me to a re-education camp for suggesting that I'm calling in from the seat of colonial and imperial violence. He's also wanting to redefine asylum. So at the moment, I sense that the work I make to give an idea of how my work relates to the social inequalities and politics of our time is that healing is a process with which I sort of make that visible in some respects through my work. The title today, Looking After, suggested to me, given that I've got an interest in language and how we communicate and come together and articulate and equip ourselves for healing and for art and for conversations, is the idea of care and history and the potential, I suppose, for mutual support and growth. The provocation, how would you define healing in your work, is something I've been thinking about all day. I wanted to emphasize again how healing within my work, it is process, it's research-based and reflection, introspection, a reckoning. It's an embodied praxis that I'm working through in a or with an emphasis on repair, I suppose. When we're speaking perhaps of colonial trauma, that's something that affects everyone. How do we speak to one another about that? That's something that's certainly missing in conversations in the UK. It's a non-starter with some people, as it is worldwide, to confront our colonial trauma and make space for healing. So my work is about observing that and as praxis, thinking about how we look after one another, how I look after myself and then look outwards, how my self-care is affecting others. So I wrote down elements of self-care that I'm practicing within my work now, more sort of latterly, and that's breathing. I'm bringing yoga practices into my work. I believe that part of self-care is intimacy, or an important element of self-care. Then I was thinking about what are the essentials that we all require for living, and that is an understanding of our histories and being able to speak them through. It's also housing, security, safety in relationships, nourishment and sustenance, and a care for how we grow and breathe together, free public services, free healthcare, and public ownership of transport and utilities, and workers' rights. And then straddling that is what we have currently, where those aren't realities for many people, that they're privileged destinations. So you need to have considerable wealth to be able to access education or therapies or treatments. I wanted to just end on how my work is now sort of emphasizing or simultaneously has been emphasizing institutional accountability, and I'm interested in how we utilize the law. About to come out in The Guardian this week, hopefully, is the article on how me and two fellow artists have agreed a settlement with Tate out of discrimination. How we work within arts and culture isn't an even playing field, and so I'm advocating solidarity amongst all workers to have fair working conditions, and so with that I'm envisaging how we come together to influence and implement the policies that we're working through as praxis within our artwork, how we create new structural imperatives to support holistic lifelong curriculums for learning, growth, mutual aid and community building, and towards transformational justice, which is expecting a lot out of artwork and my funny little practice from Scarborough. But you're seeing the eyes of Sarah Reid here, a Black woman who was detained in Holloway prison and refused her medication and subsequently found dead under suspicious circumstances. These latter watercolours are all marking individuals who have in some way or another demanded the transformational justice that I'm working alongside you all towards. Thanks very much. I think I've gone over.
Well, thank you so much to our four speakers. That was really wonderful and thoroughly interesting. I thought I might start our discussion with, well, I guess in response to some of the comments in the chat, a sort of reformulation in the spirit, of course, of robust discussion and collegiality, and just to emphasize the importance of both those aspects of our conversation today. So I wanted to actually ask all our presenters, considering the important and difficult work that they are doing, to perhaps offer some comments about their own relationship to the material and to the work. Perhaps they want to share some thoughts about their own positionality with our discussants and with the audience, and similarly, sort of following on from that, because this is a conversation, an ongoing conversation about art and healing, we're sort of taken by some of the different terms that have come up in the discussion today, terms that I'm not sure have come up in earlier discussions as part of the series, terms such as truth-telling, testimony, repair, and I sort of wanted to hear from our participants, our discussants today, about whether, I guess, what kind of healing do you think can be done when dealing, well, in sort of an artistic and visual media, when we're talking about traumas and violences that are, you know, as devastating as the kind of colonial project and its sort of ongoing traumatic legacies. So I might, and of course, you know, please respond to whatever aspect of the question you would like, and similarly, if you would not like to respond to certain aspects of the question, that is your prerogative. So I might hand over to our speakers in order, perhaps, that they spoke, if that's okay. And maybe actually I'll get Susie to start. If that's all right.
Thanks, Keren. Yeah, such a really crucial question, and I really welcome the opportunity for us all to be able to share on it. Not only am I a non-Indigenous Australian, I'm a white Australian. So, and another really significant aspect of how I'm approaching or trying, you know, attempting to grapple and be part of these hugely important conversations is that I was born and grew up in Lutruwita, Truona, Tasmania, and you know, all of you would know that in particular formulations of hierarchies of race, particularly by white Europeans, there was often this positioning of Tasmanian Aboriginal people as though they were at the very bottom of that hierarchy, and that's something that I really remains present with me in all kinds of ways, and I really attempt to bring that sort of very uneasy acknowledgement and kind of, in a sense, personal in terms of growing up with some really persistent myth making, and that's something that I think really leads me to seek to be as engaged as possible and to acknowledge as fully as possible the incredible resilience and creativity and survival, particularly of Tasmanian Aboriginal peoples, who there has been this incredibly long-lived myth of extinction. And so the number of levels on which resistance is being performed and continually performed, and that's an ongoing project. And we saw a bit of work from Julie Goff, who forms part of that diverse and ongoing resistance. And I think, like you, Keren, I'm really find very useful and interesting some of the terms that have come up. So particularly Dorota and Jade, solidarity, and I think truth-telling and testimony has really run deep through all of our presentations. And something else that I did want to just touch on, and I think again, Dorota, you've just brought this out so beautifully, is that sense of, I guess if I'm using the words of an Indigenous scholar here, Sandy O'Sullivan, the Colonial project of gender. So I think there's hugely significant work going on in this space. And again, I'd like to acknowledge just the that Indigenous people, scholars, are at the forefront of this, as they always have been. So thanks for the opportunity to respond to that.
I suppose I'm next. So I'm from Canada originally, and now live and work in the UK. So I'm an immigrant to my current country of residence. I'm of mixed race, and I actually don't know how to frame this last part, because I suppose it depends on who I'm talking to. I have a long-term medical condition that would be classed as a disability under the UK Equality Act of 2010. But I'm at the stage right now where I'm reluctant to call myself disabled, if that makes sense to anybody. So that's sort of my position. And I'm an art historian. I did my PhD in art history, and the work that I do around the visual culture of cholera really comes out of that work. But the links to the current pandemic actually came out of the practice of teaching. So I think Jade's discussion around how empowering teaching and learning can be as a process of truth-telling and repair is particularly interesting, because during the lead up to the pandemic, I was commuting into work to teach a module that I designed on the visual culture of Victorian diseases. And during those commutes, I'd pick up the Metro newspaper, as you do, and you read it on transport. And I started seeing these images each morning about how this current pandemic was being framed, and I thought, oh my goodness, this is frighteningly familiar. And so going into my classroom with my third year students to discuss the historical representation, visual representation of 19th century disease, and then having these contemporary representations was really interesting, and talking through that opened up new insights into the way that we essentially, and I've said this to my students, we think we've moved very far from the 19th century, and we actually haven't. We are still in very many ways embedded in that imperial and colonial moment, and those legacies carry on. So that's sort of my response. I don't want to take up too much more time because we have a lot more speakers to attend to.
Yeah, no, thank you both, and also thank you for those questions. I think they're really necessary, and I'm glad to kind of be able to speak to them. I think maybe if I start just by kind of outlining my positionality and how that then kind of frames how I think about some of the questions that we work with in the collections. I'm not an Indigenous scholar. I am a British Asian. I've never been to South Asia. I'm very much a Londoner. That's how I understand myself. But within that, there are these kinds of distinctions, right? So, for example, the first time that I went into museum stores as a kind of newly minted researcher, one of the first things I saw were human remains from Egypt and also from Punjab, which is where my family originates from. As I say, I've never been there. It's not kind of something I feel, I suppose, I don't know how to phrase this. I was going to say I don't feel like an intimate connection with that space, but obviously there is that connection, and I certainly felt a particular way when I saw those items kind of tucked away in a storeroom, right? So obviously this kind of has an impact on how I approach the questions of, sensitive objects from other kind of spaces, from other kind of histories. And I think, as part of that, there is a kind of urgency, I feel, to remain on the edges of these institutions if you are able to do so. And I think, in short, there was another question about, is the kind of work that I'm doing, particularly with Wellcome, given that their history is in kind of big pharma, essentially, and their links to that, whether that's a kind of cover, the work that I do for their inheritances. And I think, in short, yes, there's definitely a tension between these institutions and the kind of inheritances and legacies that they carry with them, pivoting to suddenly champion movements like Black Lives Matter. Everyone's kind of rushing to decolonize their collections, etc. There's definitely a tension there. However, I do think it's really important to kind of recognize that those who were actually involved with some of these movements, they're very supportive of some of these causes. And also, not all museum workers are the same. I think Jade spoke to really, really beautifully to the kind of necessity of understanding the unequal access that people, even those who work, within or adjacent to the arts have. to the kind of structures of power that inform those institutions. But thank you for the question. It's really important.
Thank you. Is that my turn, Raven? Thank you. I positioned myself in my brief remarks that kind of in my various identities as a feminist Holocaust scholar, as a second generation kind of recipient or of my father's Holocaust trauma, most likely as an immigrant to Canada and therefore a settler. But from like the point of view of Holocaust studies, like Holocaust scholars have been and survivors of the Holocaust, we have been coming to terms with that trauma and thinking about it and evolving all kinds of now really sophisticated tools for over 70 years now. So when I talked about these evocations of the Holocaust by Indigenous writers and scholars and activists, like in the 1990s and before and also after, they were, so to speak, borrowing these tools from the toolbox of Holocaust scholars because we have had such a kind of rich toolbox to share. But what I am learning recently, and that again in the wake of Indigenous cultural and political resurgence, and I'm really humbled to discover now how much I am learning as a Holocaust scholar from my Indigenous colleagues. And like the first thing I will mention, I will not unpack it right now, is I am now fully realizing that the attempted annihilation of Eastern European Jews was a colonial genocide. And that really changes my thinking about the Holocaust, like dramatically. So the next thing I want to say is when I think about trauma and healing in the space where I am now in Canada as a Holocaust and genocide scholar, I can't sort of impose my knowledge about trauma, and I've done a lot of work on trauma theory and memory studies, et cetera, et cetera. I can't just take it and apply it to thinking about trauma that my Indigenous colleagues and friends have gone through. So that just really makes us realize that like the very concept of trauma and healing is also entirely culture specific. So like in Canada now we have trauma theories that come out of Indigenous communities and Indigenous practices and Indigenous relations with land and water. So again, this is really important for me as a Holocaust scholar or genocide scholar, again, not to try to impose these kind of Eurocentric concepts of like trauma and gender onto other cultural contexts and my colleagues who come from other cultural contexts, and I have to make an effort to like really listen and like humbly listen to what I have to say and try to understand knowledge systems that are very different from what I was schooled in. And maybe last thing, there is, I'd be cautious to say this, but there is also kind of settler trauma. So these are very different traumas that we have to come to terms with and cope with, and probably with different tools. And then there is the process of healing of the relation between settlers and Indigenous peoples. And I think it's important to kind of maybe distinguish between what we are trying to attempt in a given circumstance. And maybe I just kind of draw attention to that artwork that I shown by Rebecca Belmore, and maybe I can put like some links to some of other works by Canadian artists, but that work was really significant because it was in this like, you know, National Art Gallery of Canada, like right in the capital. But I see that work as like really embodied and site specific, because it just really disrupts this like really kind of powerful colonial space, but it enables a kind of encounter, right, between an Indigenous artist and Indigenous participants and settlers and a settler colonial institution. So this goes to my last point that I think Susie also mentioned about kind of creating these spaces of solidarity. And I kind of think of it of like co-thinking and co-imagining and co-witnessing and kind of relationally, where we can engage in it together from our very different subject positions. Thanks.
Thank you. I was just looking up about the kintsugi method of repairing broken pottery, a Japanese technique, and I suppose it might actually be in this book that I'm currently reading called Sensuous Knowledge, Mina Salami, or it might have been in the Erin Manning book that I've got by the bed, but it's current, this idea that we can make something beautiful out of something that's broken. I'd really like to speak to everything that's just been said in answer to the question, but I won't. I did make some notes again, and I've got some thoughts about the words that you picked out, Keren. I was also wondering about sort of sharing anecdotally, and then I wanted to highlight what Amanda was saying about learning and education, and I had a sort of cursory look on the resources for the rail community, which is vital and necessary. And then I was questioning how we pick and choose perhaps from that what we support or what we show solidarity towards. And I wonder how our comradeship transfers to settle a trauma, as Dorota then brings up. You know, how can we hold that? How do Indigenous people hold that? I'm in awe, without continuing subordination. And the anecdote I was going to locate in my environment, which is more or less exclusively white, and it's where I grew up. I have lived in cities, but I'm back here for one reason or another. I go and play tennis because it makes me feel good, and I'm getting better at it through practice. And I'm feeling my body more than I did as a teenager. I'm understanding my body, so I've got more confidence to play with three people who I don't really know. And on a Thursday, there's a ladies' tennis, and 2 weeks ago, I brought up we were talking about restaurants or places to eat in the locale, and I brought up how the last time I'd been to one of the places that was discussed, there were people in blackface and exotic fruit on their head, and it was normalized because it is normal round here. And I was told in no uncertain terms that is part of English culture, to grow up and get used to it. And that's when I wonder how I can hold the discomfort then of confronting that. So then when we come to words like truth-telling or testimony or repair, how do we each equip ourselves to be in the moment and that is the embodied practice, I suppose, that I'm exploring, so that I can speak truth, and I can support others who are speaking their truth. Yeah, I was also just wanting to ask if the questions that are in the chat, whether we'll be addressing those later, because I wanted to acknowledge that Tos has been asking questions throughout, and provocative at times, and at the same time, the specific question for me was about sort of this is institutional accountability, and I think whether it's possible to affect change in existing structures. And I wonder if an organisation like Brooklyn Rail and others globally actually are the alternatives that can shape new futures, along, again, coming back to the settler trauma. Do we emphasize the institution and put our energies and labor into the institution and into those that perhaps don't want to learn, or do we work in solidarity with these alternatives? I return a question rather than answer. Thank you.
Yeah, a provocative and interesting question. If anybody would like to respond, please do. I have a sort of, we have a few minutes left, and I have one sort of final kind of question or comment to offer to our speakers, and sort of prompted by images that were shown by all of you, starting with Amanda's puppets, the cholera puppets, through to Shelley's discussion of the mask, Dorota, that image you presented of the residential school as the facade versus the sort of detention camp behind, and then finally, of course, Jade's fascinating embodied practices. I was kind of interested about this theme of masks or facades, surfaces versus kind of depth, and how surface versus depth plays out in the both the kind of visual material and that you're grappling with or producing, and this project of decolonization that we're all sort of discussing, and healing, ultimate healing. So if anyone wants to jump in and respond, that would be great. I mean, Jade, you're big on my screen, so would you like to talk a tad more about your art practice and the importance of embodiment, I guess?
Thank you. Yeah, and I was struck also by the latter part of your question. Sorry to go around it. I was thinking about how palimpsest is a factor with which to sort of consider when reading my work, and something I'm aware of when making the work. So, for instance, the work where I use charcoal, and latterly, just to say, I'm building or engaging the process, those that can help me make the charcoal, and that the charcoal burn, which is sort of a 5-day process, becomes part of the work, so people can see the energy and labor. Yes, the work that's made on the wall, it's like a skin, and maybe it reflects ourselves as well in that way, that we've got these layers that are invisible, as Amanda beautifully pointed out as well, and uniquely to her, that there's the fabric of the wall that can stand as a metaphor for our own sort of solidity and vulnerability. I don't know if I've answered your question there, but I've said some words.
No, that was a lovely response. Did anyone else have any final thoughts they'd like to share before we hand over to our poet?
We have a question from GE, and he should be able to unmute right now.
Thank you so very much, and thank you to the panel for taking us to places we really need to go. My question is, and this is to anyone who may feel moved to talk about this. Can any or all of any of you maybe speak to this idea of reparations, of incessant work of repair? We talked a little bit about the Japanese tradition, and how that work might affirm that it's through the kind of potentialization of history that the work of reparations could yield a recovery of shared world of common good and care. And I thank you for anyone that might want to contribute to that. Thank you so much.
I can just jump in, and I don't know if that was a reference, but likely a coincidence, and maybe refer you to a book that came out in 2019 by Ariela Azoulay, that's called Potential Histories. I don't know if that rings the bell. And so again, like Azoulay kind of reimagines, in that book, Azoulay reimagines histories that will have been and that did not happen. And for her, the work of repair is to sort of go back and reimagine all of these trajectories of histories that have been eradicated by colonialism, imperialism, and all of these regimes. So I find it, and I spoke about like co-imagination, so I'm kind of trying to relate it to that. And I think this kind of project of like potential histories through like the work of co-imagination in like decolonial artwork, I think maybe would be a good way to sort of begin that kind of answer to your question. I can't hear you. Can you unmute yourself?
I'm sorry, I somehow got muted. I thank you so much, and if somebody could drop the link of that book somewhere, perhaps
right now,
I'd really appreciate it. Thank you so much. So exciting. Thank you so much.
And we have one more question from Elizabeth Lee, and I'm going to allow you to unmute now. If not, I can read it on your behalf.
Oh, hi. I had a very specific question about sources that I wanted to follow up on, and this can just happen in the chat, but I know that Shelley Saggar had mentioned a few names of people whose work had inspired her in her kind of reimagining of these museum labels, and I'm very interested in that topic, and just was hoping she could share those names. I'd be interested in looking into them myself. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I'll drop them in the chat. I did see your message. Let me just drop them now.
Thank you.
And I just want to thank everybody in our conversation today. This was an amazing conversation, and you guys did a great job in answering the questions. Thank you everybody who did ask a question. We're gonna now, we have a tradition at the Rail to end our events and conversations with the poetry reading. So to introduce Timothy Liu, Poet Timothy Liu is the author of 12 books of poems, most recently Let It Ride. He lives in Woodstock, New York. And Timothy, you should be able to unmute and please.
Hi, wow, this has been such a great healing and challenging time to listen to all your presentations. I'm just going to read two poems today. The first one's very short. I was thinking about Amanda showing us those cholera puppets and particularly the sort of daily news things that she showed in our current pandemic. This is overheard while waiting in line to pay for gas, thousands of miles from Wuhan. I'm not eating Chinese food anymore. Gets my goat. Just thinking, those motherfuckers started this whole thing in the first place. And I'm going to end with a longer poem. I prefer elegies over eulogies. Just say that. And this is an elegy. The poet quit her teaching job on the East Coast, flew back to a ranch surrounded by vineyards her father had left her. Old vines of Pinot Noir she would harvest and sell to local vintners who made names for themselves. Labels familiar to us amateurs who cared enough to know how many points Wine Spectre gave certain vintages. Scores printed on tiny cards stuck to cases stacked up at boutique liquor stores we would walk our dogs to. She too had retrievers racing alongside horses and other four-leggeds before they burned alive inside her barn, struck by wildfires while she slept. The winds changed directions that fast. Go to bed one person and wake up another. Watch volunteer firefighters put out the flames. No time to gather up her things she would return to fetch when it was safe to come back. The blackened loam and charred hills would recover. Certain seeds split open only if the ground is hot enough. Nature has a long game, she said. Her mind slowly unhinged. Somehow seeing animals destroyed like that, unable to stampede out of weathered boards, consumed in an instant, mere matchsticks a child got tired of playing with, sent floating down a creek no one pictured would ever run dry, isn't even the half of it. Hearing horses scream like that, horses she rode high along ridges as she surveyed a paradise her father had left her. She never really recovered from that kind of shock, her sister said. I remember when she quit her job to go back west. I remember the envy I felt when she got her teaching post, feeling it again when she gave it up. I who had yet to receive my own inheritance. Only now she's dead and buried somewhere on her property after having suffered a drawn-out agony. My envy, so petty. No compassion. Jealous. When a book of hers came out, she had it so easy, barely making it past her 60th birthday. No chance to patch things up when the cancer did her in. She gathered together one final book, a thick one that got a starred review from a place most of us despised. Seems so trivial when scorched over earth is once again in the fire's path, myself so far away from posted apocalyptic pics as I surf my socially distanced life. Funny how we simply stopped talking when she got on a plane to come and see my husband's art opening, a modest group show featuring a drawing of his that never sold. Can't remember what it looked like, only that she was bored. Would I mind if we got out of there? So we dropped her off at some hotel in a swank part of town, saying, "Why did you even bother showing up?" I don't regret a thing. In fact, was glad when I saw her place had burned down. Heard about it through hearsay, her horses haunting me still, the way their deaths had managed to finish her off. Nor is there anything I can do about those wildfires burning now. My brother posting pics, an orange noonday eclipse threaded through the Golden Gate as he tries to walk his dogs, ashes collecting in a garden spider's web.
Thank you so much, Timothy. That was amazing. And thank you to Dorota, Amanda, Shelley, Karen, Jade, and Susie. We'd also like to thank Tanya and Suzanne for helping make today's event possible. We'd like to thank the Terra Foundation for sponsoring our NSE program and making these daily conversations possible, and for their support of our growing archive. You can view today's event in our full archive on the Rails YouTube channel. Over the past 22 years, the Brooklyn Rail has brought together art, music, dance, film, theater, literature, and thoughtful social and political mediations in our monthly publication and in our public events, like here in our daily NSE. Please check the chat for a link to donate to support our writers, editors, and operations here at the Rail. And join us tomorrow for a conversation at 1 p.m. with John Gerard and Charlotte Kent on art and technology. And we conclude with a poetry reading with Flora Field. You can now turn on your microphone and say goodbye as we leave. It's been a pleasure, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thank you so
Thank you.
much.
Thank you.
Karen. Thank you, Amanda.
Thank you, Dorota.
Thank
Thank you, Susie.
Thank you, Susie.
Thank you, Amanda.
Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you,
Jade.
Shelley. And thank you for the beautiful reading, Timothy. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was incredible. Really, really wonderful conversation.